from the industry, as well as from the different programs in the Wellcome Trust in the areas of different projects that he had worked on in the development of the therapeutics, diagnostics, and all the range of different products that actually fit very well within the plethora of issues we have with the AMR, I would say. Welcome, Dr. Tim. And the last but not least, Dr. Jay, who is the representative from the industry. As I mentioned, we have a diversity of stakeholders here. Hi. Dr. Jay, he's actually wearing several hats. One of them is the industry. So since 13 years back, he joined Pfizer and is currently serving as a vice president and the therapeutic area lead on the anti-infectives at the Global Medical Affairs of Pfizer. He's an otherwise infection specialist and has a PhD in microbiology. Before joining the industry, he was actually teaching at the University of Chicago. So as you can see, we have really huge expertise today that we will be hearing as patients on how we as patients can contribute to the AMR, to the fight of the AMR, but through understanding of what actually a development of an antibiotic means, what are the pathways, what are the hurdles, and what are the things that we should know as patients so that we value the current antibiotics more, or at least appropriately. I would like to first invite Dr. Sandeep to share his views and present the R&D program at the Government of India related to AMR. Dr. Sandeep, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Neda, for your kind words. And first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to APCC for inviting me, to you, to Kavaldeep, and to my panelist fellow members, Dr. Tim and Dr. J. I would like to share a presentation. I believe I can share it now.
Yes, please.
Can you all view the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I am going to present about India's strategy for managing AMR R&D. As everyone knows that there is an increasing emergence and spread of AMR over last decades, primarily due to overuse of antibiotics, which is reducing their efficacy, and it's an estimate that the deaths due to this can be 10 million by 2050. This has become a major threat to global health, treatable diseases becoming untreatable once again. Also, AMR global issue has been discussed at the highest level internationally. There is a global action plan on antimicrobial resistance. There are many conferences, seminars, all world over. And obviously, there is action needed in many fields like surveillance, prudent use, education, new treatments, importance to foster R&D. Challenges in antibiotics R&D, everyone is aware of that there is uncertainty about the expected return on investment. Industries are not putting their resources into this one because they are not sure about their sales. Market potential is unclear, which discourages private innovation, not just for antibiotics, but also for diagnostics and vaccines. But luckily, there is a benefit because of COVID that again, people have ventured into diagnostics and into vaccines, and even governments are thinking about this one. Fundamental research in antimicrobials is scientifically very complex, and processes to ensure registration can be improved, and processes to allow commercialization of new products is often burdensome. Pipeline is weak because the pipelines doesn't contain enough products to meet present day needs, let alone the needs expected in future. As far as I know, there are only 33 antibiotics which are currently in clinical development, and it will take many years before any of them enters the market. There are only one of your assets for almost half of WHO priority pathogens. Major drug companies have exited this space, therefore not much R&D is invested, and small companies don't have resources to venture into this field. So there is an urgent need for a pipeline of innovative products. So what is the existing responses? But there are some existing responses, but further action is needed. Public and philanthropic funding for R&D is needed, strengthening global coordination. The WHO, OIE, FAO tripartite agreements, global AMR R&D hub are a few of the initiatives in which countries are working together. Too few solutions are in place to support a sustainable pipeline. Collective and national level actions can have significant global impact, and supporting antibiotic R&D is key to combat antibiotic resistance. In India, this has been considered as one of the high priority areas, and in 2010 a national level task force has been set up. 2011 national policy for containment has been adopted. 2011 again Jaipur declaration, health ministers of Southeast Asia region have declared that this is a priority area. 2012 we launched national program on AMR, and 2017 national action plan on AMR has been launched, and a daily declaration on AMR has been launched. There are many ministries involved in this one, each having a separate mandate for awareness and understanding, knowledge and evidence, infection prevention, control, optimal use, innovation, R&D, and leadership. And obviously, Department of Biotechnology is pioneering into the research and development. India is pleased to join the Global R&D Hub in 2018, and I was one of the attendees in one of the board meetings in 2018. DBT has launched Mission AMR in 2018-19. We have four-pronged approach to promote research and innovation for therapeutics. There was a requirement of a biorepository in the country, as no repository was existent, so we thought that it is important for every purpose. Then research and innovation for diagnostics, we prepared a landscape report, and along with WHO country office, we prepared national priority list for AMR specific pathogens. The repository which has been set up at NCCS Pune is already an IDA approved repository. It is already a member of WFCC, which is World Federation of Culture Collection. It is a designated repository of Ministry of Environment and Forest, and this repository will now act as AMR repository for AMR resistant microbes as well as other infective agents. This repository, since its beginning last year, has developed uniform SOPs for deposition, storage, and transport of AMR samples. It has been selected as state reference laboratory for Mahasar, which is a surveillance site of WHO of Maharashtra. Similarly, MOUs are getting signed with Kerala Surveillance Network and of Delhi Surveillance Network, which is known as WINSA. FSSAI, which is Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, as well as NCDC and AFMS have notified their laboratories to deposit their isolates to this one. So far, 400 isolates have been deposited. We were expecting a very high number, probably more than 10,000, but just because of this COVID, work has slowed down in last 6 months. DPT, in partnership with BIRAC and Bill and Melinda Gates Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have issued a call on Grand Challenges India, which has 3 specific mandates on surveillance, infection prevention and control, and R&D measures to remove antibiotics or antimicrobials from effluents. BIRAC, again, which is a sister organization of DBT, along with Nesta UK, has longitude prize of £10 million for innovative diagnostic tools. 9 teams have been supported during the period 16 to 18, and 3 teams have won boost grants, which is more than £1 lakh. DBT has collaborated with Carbex through CCAMP, and an MOU is signed into this one in 2018. It's primarily to promote industries who want to venture into this area, and the startups are getting funding out of this one. Then we have set up a very major report consortium along with US government, which basically controls or stores all the TB resistant pathogens data. These are a few of the candidate vaccines which are under pipeline through DBT support at preclinical stage, phase 1 and phase 2, phase 3. And there is a COVID vaccines which are under development in preclinical stage as well as phase 1, as well as some have reached phase 2 also. The COVID, I'm bringing it here just because this has given an impetus to research on diagnostics, on vaccines, on therapeutics, which directly or indirectly will certainly benefit the research in the area of AMR also. So we have set up our own diagnostic centers. We are making now our own diagnostics. Our vaccines are getting clinical trials. We are developing animal models. We have invested into therapeutics, and we have done the genomic studies also. We have set up 16 biorepositories dedicated only for COVID-19, set up clinical trial sites as well as immunogenicity labs. We are considering now that to solve this problem, it has to be approached as a One Health approach. That's why we have set up or initiated this very major mission program very recently, about 2 months back, which we entitled as Establishment of a DBT Center for One Health at National Institute of Animal Biotechnology. It has 7 centers in northeastern states, 12 centers in other states, and 8 disease investigation units. A national roadmap for One Health is being prepared out of this one. The way forward is there. I believe there is some error in this slide, so we have missed something, but primarily I just want to say that we have to make more investments into this area. We have to collaborate with all global best parties so that more funding into this one, more investment goes into this one, and we have to work as a team to solve this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sandeep. Thank you very much. We will be really looking forward to the results of all these, not only trials, but setting up of the surveillance system and so on, and how this can actually help us understand the AMR situation in India. We know that in India, at least the reports are saying 18% of the medicines are dispensed without a prescription, but given the size of the country, that is really still a huge challenge that we all together have to work on. And I'm very glad that you mentioned the vaccines. They're not related maybe directly, but they are certainly related to the AMR. And what I heard a few days back from another scholar was that he said, it's not the vaccines that treat the diseases or help the diseases, it's the vaccination. So even if we have the vaccines and if we don't vaccinate enough number of people, those will not be as effective as we would like. So I just want to use this opportunity as well to raise to our participants that vaccination programs, if they are available, they should be used to the maximum level possible. So to protect not only ourselves, but those that cannot actually be vaccinated, or to protect the entire society, not to mention with the COVID, that we are just grateful and thankful to the UK government for approving yesterday the first vaccine. So with such a spirit, we are turning now to Dr. Tim, who also comes from UK, from the Wellcome Trust, from a big think tank, who is really trying to look behind the edge of where the science has been. So to bring us a very independent view on what actually means this antimicrobial resistance and what are the pipelines in which we can tackle it. Dr. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. It is certainly quite an honor to be able to speak to this group because it's incredibly important that patients are participating in the delivery of solutions with this challenging global health threat. And this is something that we at Wellcome want to make sure that patient participation becomes much more central to tackling this global silent pandemic that is driven by antimicrobial resistance. So I will move to my presentation now. Great. So it's already been set out what this big problem is. I'm going to touch on some of the points that have already been covered. And as I move along, I will actually focus mostly on antibiotics, the antibiotics pipeline, and the issues there. But at the end, really, what I want to get to is to talk about, well, what are the things that we can do and that people can do to help move forward into that solution space, and not simply to have a discussion about the big problem that is facing us. And I do want to tie in, and maybe more so in the Q&A session, how does this link into COVID? What we do know is that secondary infections are one of the difficulties that are occurring for COVID patients and have to be treated. We don't know the impact of that on antimicrobial resistance, but certainly one thing we've seen is the increased need for antibiotics and sometimes the overuse of antibiotics. So it's very likely that there's going to be an increased drive of this problem of antimicrobial resistance in drug-resistant infections. But there's good in this as well. What we've seen is an increase in infection prevention control measures and other things which have actually seem to have reduced the transmission rates of common bacterial infections that end up being life-threatening. So the jury's still out as to what the overall effect of the COVID pandemic will be on AMR itself, but it certainly highlighted some very important issues about healthcare provision, and the systems around surveillance and understanding how we monitor public health emergencies. Now, with the antibiotics, this is one of the wonderful success stories of modern medicine. Antibiotics had a dramatic impact on medicine across the board, decreasing the deaths as a result of infectious diseases by 70% since their introduction in 1942 during World War II. These wonder drugs have really become part of the infrastructure of healthcare. And in some ways, we've taken that for granted. Now, it's already been highlighted, the scope of impact in the best available information today. We know that over 700,000 deaths annually are a result of antimicrobial resistance. And the projection is that will rise to over 10 million by 2050. Current research indicates that actually these might be conservative numbers. So this is a very serious threat to people's health, and this is throughout the world. And what we see is that resistance emerges always against antibiotics. And this is just showing you some of the timelines of resistance for various drugs after their point of introduction, bringing it up for about a 10-year period. One of the things that is very, very frightening, though, is if you go and look at specific details, the emergence of resistance is usually within 2 to 3 years. So it happens relatively quickly, and then that takes hold and slowly expands to the point that we lose the effectiveness of these drugs. In some cases, more than a fifth of the infections become untreatable. And this is the thing that we really need to address, is that we have this wonderful success that is a very important common feature in treating patients in all number of disease settings. And yet we are losing the ability to control and treat those infections. And then they can become not only significantly negative impact on people's well-being, but deadly. And that's simply something that we shouldn't accept. Now, those figures that I quoted or showed you before are kind of global figures. When we look around the world in specific places as to the rates of infection, that's when it becomes very, very noticeable that it's variable depending on circumstances. The world is not well covered for knowing exactly what the problem is everywhere, but where we do have evidence, it's a very bleak picture. And if you look at India, for example, there are very high resistance rates, and the impact in different settings is absolutely devastating. If you look at intensive care units for neonatal medicine, the rates of drug-resistant infections have been found to be in excess of 50% of the babies in the units. In some cases, as many as 80% of the babies are infected with untreatable drug-resistant infections. And the death rates of those babies, those patients, are in excess of 50%. So this is an area where we could have success if the drugs still worked, but when the drugs stop working, we are losing people. While we have the emergence of drug-resistant infection, of course, what we see is the world is increasingly reliant upon antibiotics. And this is a good thing in some senses. You know, we want everyone who needs an antibiotic to have an antibiotic so that they can be made well as a result of treatment with that antibiotic. But because of the biological nature of the problem here, the more we use these drugs, the more that it drives AMR. And so that is a really difficult situation. With increased need, we have increased usage, and yet it creates this problem that we need new antibiotics or indeed different ways of treating people so that they are not suffering from untreatable drug-resistant infections. We look at the pipeline, and it's already been highlighted to you by Dr. Sundeep that the pipeline has been weak. And indeed, right now, the pipeline is failing to meet the world's needs. So in this, what you can see is by decade, the number of novel, new, groundbreaking antibiotics that are introduced. And really, there was a period of about 40 years that was the golden era of introducing antibiotics between World War II in the 1940s and petering out after the 1970s. And what we see, while there have been new antibiotics introduced in the last 40 years, there has not been significant innovation there. And most worryingly, there are very few drugs in the pipelines that address the increasing resistance amongst pathogens that have been identified as priority pathogens by the WHO. Now, why is it that we have this situation? And you know, is it that the science is so difficult? Well, that's part of the reason, but in reality, it's about economics. There is a case of a market failure, that the innovation doesn't get fully rewarded so that the research and development can be done and the products can be brought to market and kept on the market. And this slide is meant to give you a snapshot of what the problem looks like. If we were to compare the R&D pipeline for immuno-oncology drugs versus the antibiotic pipelines in development, you can see just by the size of the box, there is a vastly different picture. The antibiotic space is one that is not appropriately valued. Therefore, it does not attract the research activities and certainly not the necessary commercial activities to bring those product candidates through and deliver them into the healthcare systems. So we have a market failure problem that is actually making the situation worse, making our antibiotics pipeline insufficient. It's quite stark when you look at it in terms of the potential profits that can be gained for products that are delivered into healthcare systems. At the top, we have cancer treatments, and there have been wonderful successes in transforming the prognosis for cancer patients in for a number of specific diseases, and similarly in other therapeutic areas. But you can see that the profit opportunity is very different. If you go down to the bottom of the slide, you can see here antibiotics, it's not just that it's much lower, it's negative. It is not actually good business sense right now to go into this space. And this is a terrible negative driver in this situation is even though everyone recognizes, including the pharmaceutical industry, that antibiotics are fundamentally important, it doesn't make business sense. And we need to solve this problem so that we can attract both private capital into the space to invest more in the R&D for antibiotics, and also more of the private sector to do the research and particularly the long-term development activities that bring candidates through and deliver them into healthcare systems. So what can we do about this? Well, Dr. Sandeep covered a number of things that are important here. There's not a single silver bullet solution, unfortunately. The complexity, as Neda has covered, makes this sometimes seem terribly daunting, but there are indeed a number of things that we can do, should do, and it's about prioritization. But with antibiotics, we need to revitalize that pipeline. We need to find ways to solve this market failure. Alongside of that, we need to make sure that antibiotics are looked after, we take care of them, are good stewards of them, so there's wise use. That means that we should better use diagnostics and diagnostic information to inform the appropriate use of drugs and be informed by better data about what the situation is in regards to epidemiology of infections, and also things such as vaccines and the role of vaccination in reducing the burden of infections that present into healthcare. So there are some things that I want people to take away from this, and particularly from a patient perspective. This silent pandemic needs the voice of patients. It is not a disease. AMR is a biological phenomenon that has an impact across a number of different diseases. And we need the voice of patients to speak to this issue and be advocates for why it's important to them, so that we can see better action for people to protect their health and save lives at the end of the day. We all need to become better stewards of antimicrobials. That's a case of using them only when necessary. But this needs to be done not only in a local sense, but a global perspective as well. We need global action that ensures the responsible and sustainable use of antimicrobials, and that they are made equitably available. Alongside of that, though, is the important role of diagnostics and vaccines. But if we focus on antimicrobials and antibiotics specifically, we must move to a situation where they're only used when necessary for the health of people or animals or plants. We have overusage and misusage in all of these spaces, and we need to move forward with action so that we optimize the prescribing and use in people. We also need to optimize and change how antibiotics are used in animals in relationship to agriculture, so that it's only for controlling disease and certainly not for growth promotion. And alongside of that as well, for controlling disease in plants and not simply for maximizing yields. Alongside of this, there's some other things that we must not forget, because we're all people who play multiple roles in life. It's not just about being a patient, it's about being a parent, a consumer, and living in a world with other activities. We must avoid polluting the environment from the industrial discharge, from the manufacturing of these drugs, as well as stopping the runoff from food production that actually drives the increase of antimicrobial resistance in pathogens and other microbes in the environment. And similarly, we need to do something about what happens from hospital outflows. A lot of my talk's been focused about the antibiotics pipeline itself. We must innovate. We need new antibiotics, new drugs, but alongside that, the diagnostics and the preventatives like vaccines. So the urgent call to action here is to solve the market failures. so that we can ensure sustained delivery of needed healthcare tools. Now, on this one, we need governments to act. We need governments to identify market-shaping interventions so that there can be sustainable markets for the innovation of these products. And lastly, we also must stop relying on having the drug in the first place. Let's prevent infections. So let's improve vaccination rates. Let's improve having access to clean water and good sanitation. And also we must build on the successes around the COVID pandemic for better infection control measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tim. While you said that most of your talk actually focused on the pipeline, you have given us also some of the ideas of how grave, how difficult situation is on the ground when you mentioned the neonatal intensive care units, and you said 50%, and I have 2 children, and that means that I would have to give up one of those 2 if it comes to the, I mean, it really comes to every second child being the one affected or dying from resistant bacteria. So I would really urge anyone on this session or afterwards listening to the recording to really think about every time they take any pill unnecessarily without the diagnostics, that they are actually jeopardizing someone's life, maybe in their own family even. But it was also, I'm grateful that you mentioned about the market failure, in the sense that we as patients need to also advocate within our governments as much as we can that this failure is corrected. So I would like to now call Dr. Jay Purdy, who is actually representing Pfizer, one of the loners, unfortunately, one of the very persistent companies still in the pipeline, with the data that we saw that in the number of decades, we didn't have any new antibiotics developed. If you can share with us how it feels, what are the hurdles, what are the issues with the development, and also what is Pfizer doing on the other fronts, meaning how we can improve the literacy maybe of the patients, or how we can include the patients more into this multiple fight. The floor is yours.
You bet. Thank you, Neda. And thank you for the organizers at APPC for inviting me. I would ask the group, the APPC folks, to project my slides. I think that might make the connection a little bit more smooth. Can they do that for me? Otherwise, I can share my screen, but it might be better if they project.
Yes, I guess so.
There we go.
Yes, coming.
Yeah, it's a real honor to be on this electronic stage with Dr. Tim and Dr. Sandeep. I could literally just sit down. They've covered the topic so well, and I appreciate their thought, consideration, and work to present really the key aspects of antimicrobial resistance. I am glad, though, to have a few minutes. I recognize I'm the last speaker of the day, so I'm between you and your dinner. And so I'll try to keep this fairly brief. If we can go to the next slide. As has been said, I'm employed by Pfizer. That's my disclosure. And I'm proud to work with Pfizer, one of the last large pharmaceutical companies that are still doing research in the anti-infective space, that also has a robust vaccine pipeline to prevent infections. And I'm asked sometimes why that's the case. Why is Pfizer still in the game when so many other companies have left? And I think there's a number of reasons, but I think the number one, and by far the number one, Pfizer leadership understands that without antibiotics, so much of the other things we do in medicine become impossible. If your risk of developing a multi-drug resistant infection is too high, we can no longer do bone marrow transplants. We can no longer do solid organ transplants. We can't do even elective surgeries because if that patient becomes infected, there's no way to treat them and they'll die. You can think of this as a war, and in some ways I do think of it that way, us against the microbes. And if you go to my next slide, the microbes have a number of advantages on us humans. And the first is that there's a whole lot more of them than there are of us. I don't know if I'm locked up. Could we go to the next slide? There we go. This is a sign I saw when I flew into Amsterdam for a meeting. And it talks about, if you advance one, that there's 835,000 humans in Amsterdam and a gazillion microbes. Could we advance to the next slide? A gazillion, I had to look up. 835,000 is 8 times 10 to the 5th. A gazillion is 1 times 10 to the 86,430. And I know that this is just a sign to remind us of the disproportionate battle we're fighting. But really, even in Amsterdam, a gazillion could well be an underestimate. There's far more of them than there are of us. And if you go to the next slide, the ones that exist are also becoming better at what they do. In some ways, we're becoming outgunned in this war. This is just a report by CNN on a woman who had traveled and came back with a CRE, that's a carbapenem-resistant Enterobacter acae, a fancy name for a bacteria that's good at getting resistance. And she died because we had no way to treat her. Now, this woman had traveled to India, the home of this Congress, but you don't have to go that far afield to find these pathogens. As a physician, I've seen multiple patients, and when I think of them, I do get a little bit of emotional, that died because we didn't have an antibiotic that could treat them. You see in the picture here, it's called a Petri dish. And if you look on the right one, you see the haze, and that's a monolayer of bacteria. It's just growing across that agar, which is like a jello. The little white dots are antibiotic discs. And if the bacteria is sensitive to the antibiotic disc, it can't grow close to that disc. As the antibiotic diffuses out, it kills the bacteria. So on the left, you see a very sensitive strain. All of the bacteria are sensitive to all of the antibiotics, and they can't grow close. This woman's on the right showed that the bacteria could grow very close to the discs and was resistant, and so there was no way to treat her. So in this case, this was a battle lost in the war with antimicrobial resistance. Now that's an individual, and I think it's good to focus on individuals. I could tell you stories myself if we had the time, but we don't. But if you go to the next slide, this is data that Dr. Tim presented just a little bit earlier. It's from the McNeil report. It's a report that was commissioned by the UK government. Maybe we're delayed. If we could go to the next slide. And what it shows is that currently, right now, we have approximately 700,000 deaths each year due to antimicrobial resistant pathogens. So 700,000 is a number that's very difficult for a human to get their mind around and think, what is 700,000 people? But think about your hometown and how is that multiples of your hometown, or what percentage of your hometown 700,000 is? And that brings that number down a little bit closer to home. Of course, in families that have lost a loved one, for them, it's not a statistic, it's a death and a loss, and someone who could be here if we had good antibiotics that could treat them. Can we advance to the next slide? There we go. So that's what I'm talking about. Now, the McNeil report estimated that if we don't address antimicrobial resistance, that number is going to swell. And Dr. Tim is exactly right. There's papers written on why the 700,000 estimate is in all likelihood very conservative. It's low. It should be much higher. But there's no question that if we don't address this problem, the number of deaths due to antimicrobial resistance is going to swell. It's estimated to hit 10 million by the year 2050. That's 10 million a year by the year 2050. That will surpass current cancer deaths, and you can see some of the others. Measles, road accidents that we all wear seatbelts for are only 1.2 million. Not that I'm making light of 1.2 million people, but the point is, this is a threat that is looming on the horizon, and we as a society will either deal with it or we won't. And if we don't get to choose the consequences. We will suffer the consequences. If we go to the next slide, this is a second slide from the O'Neill report showing where those deaths will occur. There's no question that this is a global issue, but the damage of these resistant pathogens will be felt disproportionately in areas of the world that have a more difficult time dealing with them, Africa and Asia, especially developing Asia. And so this is a responsibility for all of us to address. If we go to the next slide, it's probably, people think, well, could it get better without doing anything? Is that possible? And that's highly unlikely. And the reason for that is the way medicine is progressing. Could we go to the next slide, please? There you go. So you see in the middle, the current estimate of 700,000 increasing to 100 million. If you put that into economic terms, now human mortality far outweighs economics. I'm the first to admit that. Nevertheless, especially in low income countries, they'll bear a disproportionate impact of antimicrobial resistance. It's estimated by 2050 that GDP will decrease between 1.1 and 3.8%. But again, that's borne by the people least able to support that decrease, and it will damage their ability to do the things they need to do, including getting health care in other areas. And part of the problem is we're seeing more patients hospitalized. We are getting better in the field of medicine in many areas. We can treat cancers that otherwise patients would have died. Bone marrow transplant patients live far longer than they ever did before. Patients with congenital illnesses can live longer than they've done before. That does mean, though, we need to support those patients medically, and that will lead to increasing rates of hospitalization, as we've seen. And right now, approximately 1 in 18 patients admitted to the hospital will develop a hospital-acquired infections. Those infections most likely to have multi-drug resistance. We're seeing the emergence of these superbugs, bugs that are very difficult to treat. And it goes back to COVID. Even before COVID, we can think of Ebola. We've seen outbreaks of pathogens that we don't have good therapy for, and that we have difficulty controlling. And it's a scary thing. You almost have to go back, and with all the pandemics, I enjoy history. I've gone back to reading about the Dark Ages and the Black Plague, where bubonic plague would travel on the back of rats into a new city, generally on trading boats, and would infect that city. And over the course of a handful of months, 50, 60% sometimes of that population would die from that disease because they didn't have resistance. And so Ebola has been a wake-up call, I think, to countries, to governments, even to corporations, that we really need to think about what's going to come and develop drugs to treat them, because if we don't, we're going to be in a very difficult space. Dr. Tim has done a great job talking about, and Dr. Sandeep as well, that we have fewer antibiotics being developed. That's partly because many companies have left the field, and we need that support back. And at the end of the day, it boils down to there's limiting reward for antibiotic development. Companies tend to choose those areas where they'll have a significant return on their investment. And that's true whether it's in the car industry, whether it's in the food industry, whether it's in airplanes. You cancel flights to those cities that you're losing money, that they like to do that. And so there's only now a few that remain despite the financial limitations, and that creates this global issue. And we all need to be involved in ongoing policy development that will help address that. So if we go to the next slide, I think it's important before we get too far in to remember the miracle that is antibiotics. You remember the first antibiotic developed was by Sir Alexander Fleming. And you see on the right, what happened was he had a petri dish with bacteria on it. That's the little white dots. And it got a contaminant. It's mold, penicillium, contaminated his bite. That's the big white dot. And if you look around that big white dot, all the dots are smaller. And what that told him is that penicillium is secreting something, making something that prevents those bacteria from growing to the size of the big white dots. And he put that together, and that's how penicillin was developed. You can see below it was a newspaper report, penicillin, new wonder drug from mold. And it really was a wonder drug. If we go to the next slide, this is data published quite a few years ago, 1964, which shows patient survival with pneumococcal bacteremia. So it's pneumococcus is a bacteria that infects the lungs typically, and then can spread into the bloodstream. These are those patients that have spread to the bloodstream. The survival rate was dismal. If you look at the lower curve, that's with no treatment. And the survival rate is below 20%. It's a bad infection to get. If you took a patient that had survived and transferred their serum, their part of their blood, the antibodies in their blood, to a patient that was infected, you could improve survival to some degree. You're looking at a little bit over 50%. But then look at the top curve, penicillin, and how much it impacted the survival of those patients. The problem is now you would never use penicillin to treat a serious infection. It's just ludicrous to think about. And that's because as we've talked about, the use of an antibiotic creates its own demise. You put pressure on the bacteria to develop resistance, and they certainly will. That doesn't matter whether you use the antibiotic correctly or you use it incorrectly. Either way, you're developing resistance. It's just that if you use it incorrectly, there's absolutely no benefit to the patient, and it needs to be avoided at all costs. But penicillin is a great example. Compare that to, excuse me, a high pressure drug. My bet is a good number of folks on the call take a high blood pressure pill every day. And that pill, you don't become resistant to it. You can take it 50 years and you won't become resistant. Or a diabetes pill. You're not going to become resistant to that pill, and you can take it for the rest of your life. Even things like narcotics, if you're in a chronic pain situation and a doctor puts you on something like morphine, your body may develop resistance to it, but you can't transmit that resistance to your child or the neighbor or your grandparent. This is a resistance mechanism that can spread through the community and cause the deaths that we've been talking about. If we go to the next slide, this is a table showing the pre-antibiotic death versus the post-antibiotic death rate for a number of infections. And if you look all the way to the right, you can see the change in death. And what we see is a remarkable improvement with antibiotics. And we have to consider, if bacteria become resistant, we're going to lose this change in death. We're going to lose the great miracle that is antibiotics. The bottom one is one I put in simply because we all recognize in the medical world that if you're having a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, it's almost, every single patient will either get an aspirin or a clot buster, streptokinase, and it's just the cornerstone of treatment for myocardial infarction. Yet that only improves survival about 3%. Now I'll take the 3%. That's 3% is better than 0%, but compare it to something like brain infection with a 60% decrease. The one other thing I would point out, endocarditis was nearly uniformly fatal prior to antibiotics. The rate now is 25%, and we can say, boy, that's great. 25% is a huge decrease, but I don't even like the 25%. Even if we didn't have resistance, we need to continue to address these infections and find better ways to treat our patients. If we can go to the next slide, please. So Pfizer is doing a lot of things to try to address AMR, and I just wanted to show you a few. The Davos Declaration is really an important commitment that Pfizer was one of the leaders and one of the first signers that looks at a number of ways we can improve antimicrobial resistance. That includes working on efflux from factories, destroying the antibiotics that just get into the environment without benefiting patients. It includes how we promote drugs. There's many other areas of that declaration. That's really an advancement that companies around the world sign as a commitment to try to improve from a corporate perspective what we can do. We also participate in the 2020 Access to Medicine benchmark report. It's an important outside group, a non-aligned group that looks at all the different biopharmaceutical and pharmaceutical companies to encourage them to address AMR by ranking them in different areas. Pfizer is very proud to be the second ranking that was second on that list in 2020, but there's still things to be done, and Pfizer is actively doing those things. We have antimicrobial stewardship programs where we provide unrestricted grants around the world to help folks develop stewardship programs. Remember, stewardship is using the right antibiotic in the right patient for the right duration and in the right form. And that means that a lot of patients should not be getting antibiotics that are getting antibiotics. Remember, if the patient doesn't need the antibiotic, all it does is put them at risk to develop resistant pathogens within them and with them or those around them, and have the adverse event of an antibiotic with no benefit. And so that's important to deal with stewardship, to preserve the antibiotics we already have. We have an Atlas surveillance program. It's the largest in the world. It's open, available to anyone. So anyone on this call, if you want to see data from the Atlas surveillance program, just type in Atlas surveillance or Atlas Pfizer into your browser. You're asked to register. We don't track who's in and who's out, but then you can go in and look at all of that data. We update it in real time as close as we can, get that data in within just a few months of actually obtaining the data. It has to be processed and put into the system. But that gives physicians an opportunity to look at what their current resistance is in their areas and determine how best to deal with that antimicrobial resistant spectrum. We're working on responsible antibiotic sales. You know, in the past, sales reps from the antibiotic companies were rewarded based on sales. It was all about, and it's true of car companies. You're rewarded based on how many cars you sell generally. Pfizer was one of the first companies, if not the first company, to pilot an effort where sales reps are no longer rewarded on the antibiotics they sell, but on what they do, the education that they do, the number of sites that they're able to visit. And it decouples that pressure to oversell an antibiotic, because that's the worst thing that we can do. Reliable drug supply is critical. I've talked about responsible manufacturing, where antibiotics are not fed out into the environment. And then awareness, patient awareness is so critical. And we've tried to do a number of areas, work in a number of areas, including the World Antibiotic Awareness Week, where participants in a bug bus, which if I had more time, I'd show you. It's a large van that goes around and educates people about antimicrobial resistance. If we can go to the next slide. Antimicrobial resistance impacts pretty much all parts of medicine. And we've worked now to engage in a global patient community, which I think is critical to pull all of us together, working together as one to solve this problem. If we can go to the next slide. We had our first of its kind AMR Patient Summit in 2019, where we discussed the patient journey, introduction to anti-infectives and AMR, which is antimicrobial resistance. We talked about policy and how to review the gaps, how best to address those gaps, and then a workshop so that Pfizer could learn about patient priorities. It's critical that we understand patient priorities if we're going to move forward together. Because at the end of the day, if you go to the next slide, we are all in this together. We will either solve the problem. I'm sorry, the next slide. Not sure why that one came up. It must be a bill. There you go. We either solve this together or we're not going to solve it at all. And this talks about patients and patients group, pharmaceutical companies, government, regulatory agencies. It's actually much more complex than this. And my problem is I'm not great at making slides and didn't know how to do it. But, you know, foundations like Wellcome Trust, like Gates, like Institute Pasteur clearly are playing a huge role in this puzzle of solving it. And combinations, groups like IMI in Europe or BARDA in the US that partner pharmaceutical companies and governments together. And as I pointed out, our work to partner with patients groups to understand how best to progress this solution. Because if you go to the last slide, the only way we'll solve this problem is working together. What happens in India impacts everyone. What happens in the US impacts everyone. And a death in India is just as valuable as a death anywhere else. And we all need to work on this together to solve the problem. I'm a firm believer that if we can do that, if we can all focus on the issue and all be involved, we do have really an opportunity to change what could be a very dark future. We won't be looking at the types of death that we're talking about, but we could be looking at quite a bit fewer. And remember, you know, I've got 3 daughters. I always say I want to leave the world a better place for my children. I know we all do. And this work will do that. It will leave the world a better place. So thanks for your attention. And I turn the time back to Nita.
Thank you, Dr. J. Thank you. And like for the other speakers, it was so interesting to me that I really didn't want to cut off anyone, although I'm obliged to probably as a moderator. But I think it was so informative and so educational for the patients, whereby we really can realize that, yes, maybe we cannot directly go into the laboratory and develop any antibiotics, but we can at least partner with our governments, advocate with them to be able to revert or to improve the market failure, to have a better mechanism, while at the same time try to preserve the effectiveness of the currently available antibiotics. And I can tell you on a daily basis, we are hearing, and especially now with the COVID, that antibiotics, due to the diagnostic uncertainty and due to people not knowing how actually this virus has attacked us, as you said, they're outnumbering us, is the antibiotics are being inappropriately used more and more. And maybe what we are saying 2050, it might be just even a decade earlier, unfortunately. I could see in the Q&A we had few questions or more. I would say those were the reflections of the participants as to, for example, in Bangladesh, also the situation in an individual hospital reported by a student is that every patient receives, or literally every patient receives, a third generation cephalosporin, needed or not, and that the waste is not, the waste management practices are not there. So actually, through one example of one hospital, this participant is pointing to all the issues that you have raised, but he's just picturing that this is happening in one single facility, let alone how many facilities are there globally. Because we are running out of time, I wouldn't really want to keep the audience much longer. It was a great pleasure to have the three of you. I would ask the audience, if you have any specific questions to the three speakers, to please send them to us by email. We can try to respond to them. And in addition to that, I just want to add that this is just one session on the AMR. IAPO is dedicated to keep the continuing dialogue on the AMR, to have a series of webinars. We have already announced it in the GPC. Now this is the continuation of it. We've seen in the slides that majority, 80% of those predicted deaths in 2050 will be in Asia. So this is what we are doing today. We try to raise awareness and to gather many patients around us so that we can work together. And the other 40% will be in Africa. So our next session in the Congress will be in our Africa Congress next year. So I would just want to invite you that we go to Africa next time to explore the AMR issue over there. Thank you very much. And I would like to pass the floor to Kavaldeep.
Okay, thank you very much, Neda. Thank you, Dr. Jinx. Thank you, Dr. Purdy, and thank you, Dr. Sarin. I think it was very great insight into what is going on. And then I think one angle we forgot, I think we are both the Punjab element. Delhi at the moment is inundated with farmers who are protesting. And surprisingly, many of them are not wearing any of those masks and things. And when you approach these farmers in animal husbandry, you know, that you don't use antibiotics for your buffaloes and cattle, they're the first ones to really go for your throat, you know. So I think we have to bring the farmer community with us, the food production for sustainable agriculture. I think that's something very important to us because that angle is missing at the moment. But very informative. We have got very positive feedback on this. And as Dr. Neda has said, that we will be progressing this further with an alliance of patients working at this AMR. It will be of a central pillar to many of our activities. We will be looking to be established within Geneva as well with a new organization, a new platform, which we will discuss and bring you into this. And hopefully before we meet in Africa, I want to have a session at the World Health Assembly in Geneva. I'll be sending an invite to you, everybody, and I'll be sending a limited amount of support and financial support to whoever we can. But do join us in Geneva, at least in May, if things have cleared up by then, but most definitely in Africa later in the year. So thank you, and everybody, and I think we'll see you tomorrow morning, again, same time, and let's have a great session, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
And that concludes this session. Thank you for your participation at the 2nd Asia Pacific Patients Congress today.